Before this video begins, I would like to give a quick thank you to my Asban Team level patrons Fallon Cortez and Nathan Gibson. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. Okay, so we're back here again with one of those Doctor Who episodes. So when it comes to Series 8, there are a few episodes people consider duds, but two stand out as the most hated. I covered Kill the Moon a couple of weeks ago, but now it's time to step up and review Into the Forest of the Night, the other derided episode from the series. It's a mystical fairy tale episode about a worldwide forest springing up overnight to save us from a solar flare, or something like that. I don't know, it's kind of just 45 minutes of a school class walking around the woods having a conversation. Obviously, if you're familiar with my channel, you'll already know that I covered this episode back in my Defending the Despised series, but like always, that was a long time ago, and I was basically a completely different person back then. A lot has changed since I did that original video, but has my opinion changed on this episode? Well, as always, that's what I'm here to find out. So get ready, because it's time to take a deep dive into In the Forest of the Night.
There wasn't a forest, then there was a forest. Nothing surprises us anymore.
I think it's important to start with a positive, which is the titular forest, and I do think it's a big positive, at least in concept. Writer Frank Cottrell Boyce was inspired by the Third Doctor's time on Earth during his exile, with the monsters and villains coming to him rather than the other way around. Therefore, Cottrell Boyce wanted his episode to bring the danger close to home for the viewers, which manifests as this huge forest suddenly appearing in the middle of present-day London. I absolutely adore the visuals of this. The effects work crafting a really captivating atmosphere. Nature reclaiming urban spaces has always been one of my favourite aesthetics. Something that shines with sci-fi as we explore deserted planets or post-apocalyptic wastelands. It's absolutely gorgeous to see the familiar concrete expanse of London completely covered and overwhelmed by these vibrant green trees. Nature fighting back against human development. Regardless of what you think about the actual narrative of the episode and the reason for the trees, it's hard to deny how good it all looks. This premise is such a high concept idea for the show, and it creates a really fantastic hook at the beginning. It kind of sparks some deep-rooted existential dread, reminding us how small our existence is. It brings to mind that famous analogy of what happens if you compress all of Earth's history into one 24-hour clock. Say Earth was formed at midnight. The first forms of life appear at 4 AM, kind of like drunk people stumbling home, I guess. It's not until 8:28 PM that seaweed appears, with dinosaurs showing up at 10:56 before humans show up at 11:58:43 PM. Just 77 seconds before midnight, which is, you know, like now in the analogy. Yeah, that's right, in the grand scale of the planet Earth, the human race has existed for less time than you've been watching this video. Nature has existed long before us, and it will keep existing long after we're gone. Which is a terrifying thought, and this episode, you know, just casually throws that at you. Obviously, you can nitpick the forest concept, bringing up questions of why nobody working night shifts or living in different time zones noticed a giant forest growing around them, although I suppose that can somewhat be excused, considering we only see it from the perspectives of characters who slept through the event, so other people probably did notice. Pretty much all Doctor Who episodes fall apart under such harsh scrutiny. But it is inexcusable that there's just nobody around in the episode. Like, this is central London, the most populated part of the entire country. So why is it completely deserted? It's empty even before the news and government advise people to stay at home for safety. I feel like in any realistic world, there'd be loads of people out and exploring this sudden new forest. You can't tell me you wouldn't be at least a little bit interested in taking even a brief stroll around. So it just kind of feels wrong for everything to be so empty. But In the Forest of the Night isn't really meant to be a realistic episode, because it's science fantasy instead of science fiction, and that's something it wears with pride, because how can you have a planet-wide forest sprout up overnight without making it into a fairy tale story?
The forest is mankind's nightmare.
Frank Cottrell Boyce is very well known for his children's literature, writing a number of novels aimed at kids, so it's no surprise that his Doctor Who debut is very much like a children's fairy tale filled with all sorts of magic and mysticism. I mean, the episode even draws direct, obvious parallels to the story of Little Red Riding Hood.
Stick to the path, Red Riding Hood.
Cottrell Boyce was inspired by the deep dark woods of fairy tales, capitalising on humanity's natural fear of the unknown. The episode is full of ideas straight out of children's media. Talking trees, fierce animals, and a young girl with magical powers are all things at the core of the episode, which is great for imaginative kids, but not so much for the adults in the audience, because it just kind of feels a bit too ludicrous and flat. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with a fairy tale narrative. Doctor Who has never exactly been even close to hard sci-fi. but in the Forest of the Night just feels way too out of place in Series 8, especially because Robot of Sherwood handled the fairy tale and legendary folklore elements a lot better. It's almost as if this episode was written for the 11th Doctor instead, considering his era with the Ponds was heavily inspired by fairy tales. It was the main tone and aesthetic of that era of the show. Amy Pond had an eccentric imaginary friend with a time and space machine, bringing her to all sorts of wonders in the universe, which makes for an obvious fairy tale. The mystical magic of In the Forest of the Night seems like it belongs in that era, rather than the 12th Doctor's more grounded, reflective era, so it's essentially tonal whiplash for the viewer. This whiplash is further evidenced by the choice to have children as pretty much the whole supporting cast. This is because teachers Clara and Danny have taken their students for a sleepover at the Natural History Museum, so they're all stuck together in this new world of trees everywhere. And look, acting is really hard to be good at, especially if you're just a child. But In the Forest of the Night has such a hit and miss supporting cast. Sometimes they're good, like the really fun flashback of Ruby not understanding how maths works.
How do we find X?
It's there, sir, at the top.
But when they're bad, they're really bad.
This is stressing me now. When I get stressed, I forget my anger management.
Like I said, I'd never blame a child actor for being not great at acting. But this is why it's such a big risk to make all of your characters children. They overshadow the Doctor with their antics and constant questions, so it kind of gets pretty annoying. Courtney was fun in The Caretaker, and even parts of Kill the Moon, because it was just one younger character and the actor was genuinely good. This time, there's a whole group of them, and they're a huge focus of the story, so their weaker acting and writing sticks out a lot and brings it all down. They're so basic and one-note as characters, only just about managing to feel like individuals, which means I obviously have to dock it a lot of points because of how much the episode grinds to a halt to constantly cater for these supporting characters and all their interjections. They're just so wooden, if you'll pardon the pun. I think the children themselves are much less significant to the overall narrative than what they represent as people for Clara and Danny to protect. This episode plays a big role in the pair's relationship, especially because it furthers Clara's journey to becoming more like the Doctor she idolizes. Pretty much as soon as she notices the forest, she immediately calls him instead of the children's parents, who would obviously be very worried about their kids' safety. Clara quickly prioritizes the mystery over the actual children she has a duty of care for. She can't resist her inner Doctor and speculates about what's going on, trying to use Danny and the kids as her companions, similar to the way she enlisted Rixie in Flatline. It's really telling of how much she's changed due to her travels with the Doctor. Sure, she's grown in confidence and developed a lot of skills, but she's starting to lose sight of humanity and what's important. Clara's addiction to traveling with the Doctor and being the hero blinds her to her duties as a teacher and shows how much she needs the anchor of Danny to keep her safe from herself almost. He's like the polar opposite of Clara in this episode. Sure, he's intrigued and excited about the forest, but he's focused on keeping the children safe above all else, because he knows they're the priority, since their parents trust him in this role and he'd never want to let them down. It's a sense of loyalty I think the Doctor comes to respect, because he himself understands the responsibilities of a duty of care, so it helps him to see Danny in a more positive light. I know a lot of people have issues with Danny as a character, but In the Forest of the Night is one of his best episodes and it develops his characteristics and character motivations a lot. He's the third lead of the story with a much bigger role than his previous appearances. Not only is he there to keep Clara tethered to the everyday human world, but he's also there to show her how wonderful that normal world can be. Danny doesn't get lost in the mystery like Clara, instead keeping himself grounded. I like the scene as Clara invites Danny for a trip in the TARDIS, only for him to turn her down because he's already seen all he wants to see in life. Danny has already had a life of adventure and risk, but now he knows what he wants and prefers to appreciate the beauty and wonder of the things right in front of him. It's a great way to show the differences between the two characters and how they see the world. Clara feels a constant need to see more and to experience more. She can never get enough, she's never satisfied even after everything she's seen with the Doctor, because she's an addict desperate for a next fix. Danny, on the other hand, knows his own limits and is content with his place in the universe, building this life with Clara and sharing everyday wonders with her. It's great to have this new perspective, along with Danny confronting Clara for lying about returning to the TARDIS travels.
Today you thought the world was going to end. You still didn't tell me the truth.
I tried.
Kill the Moon and Mummy on the Orient Express saw Clara vow to leave the Doctor for good, only for her to change her mind and start lying to Danny about no longer travelling in the TARDIS. This further showed how much of an addiction this is for Clara, and how she physically can't stay away. Obviously there's nothing wrong with her travelling and being with the Doctor, but it's just the fact she's lying so much and can't just be honest with Danny, even after him pleading with her to tell the truth and not keep hiding so much from him. Even in Flatline, she comes up with lies just to keep Danny in the dark, even though he has no problem with her adventuring lifestyle as long as she knows when to stop. In the Forest of the Night sees this duplicity explode in a great way, as Danny finds Clara's marking in the TARDIS, realising she never stopped her travels. I really like how they show this understandable feeling of betrayal and hurt. All he wants is honesty from his partner, which shouldn't be too much to ask, but Clara has almost reached this point of enjoying lying. It's as if she gets a thrill and a rush from it, which isn't exactly healthy for a relationship. I like how Danny's role in this episode allows us to actually explore this aspect of their relationship. He had issued an ultimatum of sorts during the caretaker, so for her to go back on her word like this is a huge breach of trust, and it's great that he doesn't just forgive her. Even at the end, it lingers like a cloud over the pair as Danny again asks for honesty, wanting her to finally be upfront and explain everything, because he just wants to understand why she feels the need to lie so much. And of course, let's talk about the Time Lord in the middle of this relationship drama.
I've just informed you that a solar flare is going to wipe out your planet. You're worried about a row with your boyfriend?
Even though the 12th Doctor has a bit less of a prominent role in this episode, he's a really fun and charming part of the narrative, with Capaldi's performance excellent as ever. There's a lot of great comedy, especially when he's interacting with the annoying children in the TARDIS.
What the round bits for?
Ask your teacher, come on, down from there!
He's like an exasperated granddad running around after all these kids, and it's quite funny to see, especially because of how unsocial he can be. It makes for a nice dynamic, especially between him and the inquisitive Maeve at the beginning.
I'm lost. Please can you help me?
It's that way.
It's clear that Capaldi had a lot of fun making this episode, but it's not just about the comedy. In the Forest of the Night is great for taking the Doctor off guard with this mystery even he has no answer to. There's an absolutely phenomenal deleted scene from this episode, where the Doctor recalls a childhood vision he had when he looked into the untempered schism, seeing a mighty forest rise and fall within seconds, much like this Earth forest. It's a brilliant speech reminding me a bit of how the 10th Doctor would reminisce about Gallifrey, a bittersweet reflection on the Doctor's lost past. The scene also addresses the aftermath of Day of the Doctor, with Clara wondering if Gallifrey is involved in this crisis. It was designed as a way to remind the audience of the planet ahead of Death in Heaven, and I really wish this sequence stayed in, because it gives the Doctor much more of an interesting and useful role in the episode, whilst also adding in that intrigue around Gallifrey's potential return. You may have noticed I haven't mentioned any kinds of proper threats or villains yet, and that's because this episode doesn't really have any, which is both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it's a shame that the closest thing to a villain is some wolves and a tiger from London Zoo, which have no real contribution to the plot outside of one small action sequence. It leads to the episode just kind of being people wandering around for 45 minutes with barely any danger for the majority of the narrative. I can definitely see how this would become boring, especially if you don't care for the characters the story is trying to develop and explore, because at its core, In the Forest of the Night is a character piece. There didn't need to be a villain or a monster. Doctor Who in the modern era has kind of hamstrung itself by always having a conventional antagonist, making episodes like these feel like a disappointment to some viewers. I mean, even the Doctor always expects there to be a villain of some form, something Twice Upon a Time later explored. I just don't think In the Forest of the Night does a good enough job with its no villain approach. It doesn't feel like it's used to make a point about the Doctor, it just feels a bit cheap and pointless. In the Forest of the Night points towards a big solar flare as the threat within the narrative, suggesting that the Doctor can't do anything to help, kind of drawing a parallel to Kill the Moon, where he chose to walk away and leave Earth to its doom. This time, however, he has no choice. There's a fantastic scene between him and Clara as she tries to send him away and save himself. It's a beautiful moment between these two friends, and it's so well acted. It mirrors that previous episode, with the Doctor even quoting Clara's speech back to her to show how much he's learned from the experience.
You walk our earth, Doctor. You breathe our air.
I walk your earth, I breathe your air.
The Doctor realised he was wrong to be so dismissive before, and he's acknowledging he's not always right. He gets things wrong and he cares more about Earth than he admits. He's grown a lot, and it serves as a way of showing how this incarnation is softening over time and accepting his sense of humanity, things which all play a role in the overarching Am I a Good Man storyline of Series 8. Capaldi and Coleman do such great work in this scene, and it gives it such a heartbreaking feeling of finality. Clara deciding she'd rather stay on Earth and die with her people, instead of being put into the same lonely hell of an existence the Doctor is in as the last of his kind. Although it is kind of weird how she doesn't want to save the children because they'd, I don't know, miss their parents. Like, I get the basic sentimentality, but would it really be better off for them to be dead? It's such a bizarre and questionable part of the episode. This belief that condemning these children to death is somehow the right thing to do just because of sentimentality. Like, sure, they'd miss their parents and have to live on some strange alien world, but they'd be alive. Surely that counts for something. I feel like there's a bit of an elephant in the room when it comes to In the Forest of the Night, which is the part where the Doctor tells people to not give Maeve her medication, which, you know, she needs to stop the voices in her head. Sure, in the Doctor Who universe, this is because they're actually the voices of the trees in the forest, allowing for sweet, sweet exposition about why they're there, because Maeve is the Lorax, she speaks for the trees. But surely having all of this tied to medication and mental illness is kind of a dodgy message to send. I know people aren't likely to see this and go full anti-vax, but it's still kind of questionable to have this as a plot point. I don't think it was intentional by Control Boyce, since it's clear he was aiming for more of a metaphor for how quickly adults dismiss the things kids say because of their age. Rather than taking Maeve seriously, they're so quick to assume it's a medical issue that needs to be fixed, rather than just listening to her. It's like how the government immediately jumps to trying to burn the forest down, rather than entertaining the slight possibility that there's a reason it's all sprouted up. It's all meant to be an allegory, but I think it's a horrible idea to use such a contentious and topical thing as part of your commentary on humanity. Did we really need that scene? The episode works just fine without it, so it really doesn't need to be there. Oh, and also while I'm on the topic, it's really weird how Maeve's sister comes back at the end, just chilling in a bush. There's no explanation for her return after she ran away. I know Maeve pleaded for her return, but this supposedly feel-good scene instead feels more creepy and leaves you with more questions than answers. The big, slow burn mystery of the story is solved with the convenient answer of the trees being the solution to the solar flare, having also apparently shown up in past events like this to save the planet. Even ignoring the obvious scientific inaccuracies of these trees somehow being able to absorb the giant superheated plasma of the sun, it's just bad storytelling to have the main character fail to play any kind of active role in the story. Control Boyce wanted to present the natural world as an apparent threat in order to place the protagonist in an uncharacteristically powerless position, but he goes way too far with it, and effectively renders the Doctor useless instead. The events unfold the exact same way whether the Doctor is there or not, which really cheapens the episode and makes it feel so unfulfilling. There's barely any progression, it's just characters wandering around the woods and then the episode ends. That's pretty much the whole storyline. It doesn't take that opportunity to explore the Doctor being wrong this whole time, it just makes him look stupid. Like, sure, it's a great twist that the trees are good and the visuals of the impact are beautiful, but this ending just feels so unsatisfying and pointless. Even the conversation at the end about humans forgetting things feels tacked on. It's a great moment in isolation, bringing up that ignorance inherent in our species, but it would feel so much better if the storyline had used the characters and plot elements much more effectively and proactively. In the Forest of the Night had a lot of potential. There's so much going for it in concept, but the execution really just isn't good enough. It's just a bland and average episode which focuses on the wrong things and fumbles the bag more often than not. The emphasis on family adventure and childlike fairy tales completely clashes with the tone of the rest of Series 8. It feels like it's written for the wrong Doctor, which throws everything off. And the child cast really weighs the whole thing down with their acting and writing. The main strength of the episode is in the visual quality of the trees and some of the directing. It's very well shot, and that alone means you can kind of tolerate everything else, but it does feel like there are a lot of underexplored or completely unexplored themes and concepts in the story. A lot of stuff comes across as half-baked and not well thought out, which makes me think of the episode more like In the Forest of the Not Quite, because it just falls so short of everything it tries to do. Overall, I would give In the Forest of the Night a D grade on the Series 8 tier list. There's just no real feeling of progression. Sure, it has some good character work between the main trio, but it doesn't affect the wider series all that much, apart from Danny realising Clara has been lying again, so it doesn't even feel like the character work is all that important. The fake out villain idea is solid in concept, but again, it's just not really handled well in the story. It's the kind of slow, unravelling mystery better suited to the longer runtimes of classic Who, rather than the faster paced new Who, and this all leads to a payoff which makes the Doctor seem completely pointless and unnecessary, because he has absolutely no impact on the events. He may as well not be be there at all. I was very forgiving of this episode back in my Defending the Despised, but I think I was way too generous to it because it really doesn't hold up all that well, and I'd even say it does kind of deserve its heavily negative reception. Not because of the child acting, not because of the awkward medication scene, but because it's just so goddamn pointless and boring. And an extra special thank you to my Bantam level patrons Fallon Cortez and Nathan Gibson, my Platinum level patrons Maximilian Foreman and Nick's Games, and all my Gold level patrons Boots, Calvin, Daniel Shillito, Franz aka Line Vortex, Herna Verzog, Tom Azar, and Tifa Simp. Thank you so much for your support.